The United States has a somewhat fraught, ongoing relationship with fermented alcoholic beverages, and since this episode very specifically is going to catch us up on what alcohol production and consumption looked like in early 19th century America, it seems only fitting that the National Park Service visit include the Friendship Hill National Historic Site, the site of Baby America's first notable tax protest, and the fact that it very specifically got all tangled up with distilled grain spirits, which in cash-poor early American states acted as a de facto currency. Fun fact, until 1857, silver Spanish reales, or pieces of 8, were legal tender in the U.S., so using things other than American money as media for exchange has a long history. The other thing that has a long history in the U.S. is the idea that armed rebellion against a given tax policy will somehow gain the desired outcome. The irony being, even at this tax rebellion at the cusp of the 19th century, negotiation and submission were the ultimate outcome. And despite armed rebellion against tax policy never working in American history, there seems to be this unquenchable idea that maybe this time it will work. But it never does. If anything, it's just getting harder on the bystanders. The U.S. government, also true to form, was in search of a simple solution to a complex problem and was guilty, as it usually is in its splashiest outings, of targeting the wrong end of the problem. This memorial to America's first potential battle against itself is found in western Pennsylvania at Friendship Hill, the former 400-acre farm estate of one Albert Gallatin. The reason why I was drawn to it is that it's a memorial to a battle that didn't happen. Prevention and successful negotiation almost never get any press, and the people who find solutions are largely forgotten, just as Gallatin largely was. Albert Gallatin was a rather practical Secretary of the Treasury grounded in political and financial realities, but he also had a sense of grander scope. He was able to work to negotiate a sensible resolution and avoid armed confrontation on the issue of taxation, and ultimately made this almost whiskey rebellion into one that wasn't. And then he later was part of the Louisiana Purchase, which ended up with gumbo becoming an American dish. Friendship Hill, along the banks of the once frontier-defining Monongahela River, is an old wilderness as well as a place to consider people who went into government service to serve the people and the country rather than exclusively their own interests. It grants time to ponder what is possible when the goal is to build larger vistas and cooperative ventures that benefit many, rather than looking at everyone as an adversary to be crushed. Having an approach to politics based on long-term confidence and security bolstered by mutually beneficial policies may not get you headlines and only the smaller sort of institution named after you, but you do end up with some beautiful places to visit. So if you're looking for a beautiful place in the wilderness of America's oldest mountains, head for the hills in the far southwest of Pennsylvania and Friendship Hill between Masontown and Point Marion, Pennsylvania. Episode 135. Some of the reasons America is so weird about liquor. Lack of cash, lack of refrigeration, and lack of expertise. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at the roots of the commercial trade in alcoholic beverages in the United States. As in many things, because America was begun functionally as a corporate colony, it had a very limited and generally unskilled history in home brewing. To see how that and the pressure for profit has shaped the American relationship with alcoholic beverages, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that while the United States followed the Western European progression of developing beer, then wine, then distilled liquors, they did it at such a rapid and even forced pace that only limited local styles were able to develop. Further, production of alcoholic beverages was done with an eye to commercial markets rather than for community products. If you recall from the first few seasons, I talked about how absolutely dismal the early beer of the Americas was, including the desperate use of the low-sugar fibrous pumpkins and corn stalks as a source of fermentable material. To be clear, this was not the booze you can find running about on the internet where people ferment sugar in a pumpkin, the infamous Prohibition-era pumpkin gin. That's a hooch of a different sort. No, this was true beer with starches being converted to sugars and then those slow sugars turning to beer. Once grain production and molasses imports got going, there was more beer, but most of it was not particularly good. It was for the most part brewed by people who were doing it a barrel at a time with limited expertise, lousy ingredients, and absolutely nobody had thermometers. And to be precise, these were English-style ales. They were top fermented at farmhouse temperatures. The special low-temperature bottom fermenting yeast of the lager-style beers had not yet made it to America, at least not in any amount that records were made of it. Another reason it was ale over beer, hops were still largely imported. Sure, a few large farms and plantations might grow their own crops of hops, but for the most part, despite hops growing wild in the Americas, hops in well-to-do households and commercial operations were imported. It's true, gathering wild hops is a frustrating, sticky, pokey, thorny adventure, and the flavors the wild hops carry were often disappointing. And then there was the general American aversion regarding too much foraging. All of this resulted in early American beer business leaning towards these ales that didn't last long, didn't particularly use hops, and unless you were rich and were buying expertise, weren't all that good. In fact, at this point, most American beer was frankly bad. When given the option, quite a few inns and taverns tended to use it as a mixer for the stronger stuff. Oh, and then there was the fact that America is just so far south. It meant that in many states, it was just too warm to store beer for any time at all. No hops, no refrigeration, and definitely no pasteurization. That beer was going to go right off, wasting all that harvesting and carrying and brewing and waiting, which is part of the reason ciders and similar fruit wines were popular tipple in early America. When you're working with limited materials, cider and fruit wines are much simpler. With those higher sugar fruits humans consider sweet, wine pretty much just happens. The cooking needed for most beer, on the other hand, requires a whole lot of tiresome water hauling and wood chopping. Ciders and fruit wines require no fire, except maybe for the barrel cleaning before the process begins. Also, the generally higher alcohol content of fermented fruits compared to the beer meant it would keep longer and wouldn't go ropey the way bad beer would. Also, when beer goes bad and turns to alegar, the beer equivalent of vinegar, it usually isn't as strong or as useful for preserving. While the vinegar from cider and fruit wines that have turned, well, they're more or less instantly useful. Beer also takes away from grains that might go to other uses. Bread, mainly. Fruit wines and ciders, on the other hand, actually make something out of produce that would likely have gone to waste. Ciders and fruit wines can be made from gleaned or otherwise useless apples or other fruits that are often too bitter or too tart or too seedy to be enjoyed as regular edibles. Thus, early America was briefly awash in a variety of fruit wines. Apple cider, the most common and best known, was a fantastic way to turn windfall fruit, that is, the slightly overripe stuff that fell off the tree, into something useful. Unlike grain, which is arduous to harvest and must be done by people with skill, these apples and similar pears, persimmons, pawpaws, crabapples, mulberries, peaches, plums, strawberries, and plenty of other berries and all manner of wild grapes might even be gathered by children. And sure, Catawba, Concord, Muscadine, Fox, Possum, Riverbank, Rock, and Fredonia are not popular wine grapes now, but they made plenty of early American family barrels. Muscat and Niagara grapes were actually quite palatable and would be built into powerhouse local wines later in the century. And the Norton variety, largely adopted by German immigrant winemakers, would come to the rescue of the industry in Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. If anything, this period of local fruit wine brewing was the high point of American community alcohol production so far. Each region had its local produce that was made into local brews. All of this wine was not noble or special. No one had any expectation that it would be a useful trade good, and much of it was destined to be vinegar, but it was a useful community commodity. And particularly in the southeastern states, where wild summer fruits were abundant, fruit wines abounded. And so wine became a drink with an upper class and a common class. If you made your own wine, even if it was from grapes, but local grapes, that put you firmly in the lower class. This was typically considered wine, in sarcastic quotes, not the real stuff from abroad made from real wine grapes of the old country. But wine imported from Europe had a hard go of it. It sloshed around in barrels in the holds of ships, often getting heated to tropical temperatures as the ships took advantage of the best sailing times when it was warm and the most dependable winds, the trade winds which were closer to the equator. Oh, and then there was the time in the warehouses, and then rolling along the still rough and ready road network of early America, and quite a bit of the transport was done in strong, warm sun. Now, if you've been even mildly fancy about wines, you'll note nobody's keeping the wine at 80 to 90 Fahrenheit or 25 to 30 C for any length of time. This meant that most regular wine, the naturally fermented stuff that lies around 6% to 16% alcohol, was going to suffer some degradation in its quality. Sure, some of it made it over in good shape, but the rigors of the journey meant the best way to make sure wine survived the trip was to fortify it against the rigors of travel. Heat treat it ahead of time so it's as oxidized as it's gonna get, and dope it up with a little extra alcohol, that is, literally fortify it with extra neutral spirits to bring it up to anywhere around 18 to 25% alcohol. This definitely stopped most secondary fermentation microbes in their tracks. This engineered stability made Madeira wine a favorite because it could be depended on to arrive in good shape. It was fully oxidized and well doped with extra alcohol, which meant it packed a wallop. Compared to short-lived and often sour beer at around 3% alcohol, Madeira was almost 8 times as potent. Its highly intoxicating properties, along with its high price tag, led to sets of crystal decanters and notably tiny glasses to be the serving vessels of choice. One might easily consume a tankard of ale or a mug of cider, but you would sip delicately at that Madeira you had ordered from a Spanish colony over a year ago. When it came to wine, as with just about everything else that made its way in America, the status quo was not enough for most people. The 17th and 18th century British and the rich may have been failures at developing and growing grapes in early America, but immigrants from the wine-growing regions of the German states, the mountains of what was in the process of becoming Italy, the Balkan areas, and any number of places that grew wine but had been trampled by war, came to America with far more experience, and so had much better luck in this new land. Some arrived with some grapefruit stocks, but most planned to work with whatever they found in America. And fine things they did. First, there was the hilly land best suited to growing grapes that was not coveted by grain farmers. And second, the 18th century frustrated attempts to create American wine had not been entirely fruitless. So, look what I did there. Anyway. Grape varieties had been named, described, located, and cultivated. So when the German, Italian, Czech, Slovak, Greek, French, and other Black Sea and Mediterranean Sea bordering people showed up in the rapidly expanding America, local wine enclaves developed. Like the fruit wines of the East Coast, many of these were only for home and community consumption. But a few would show up at the local inns and restaurants that were starting to appear to host the expanding railroad passenger market, and evidence of them can be found on menus preserved from these early railroad hotels with dreams and pretensions. But like the wine that shipped poorly from Europe, these local new American wines tended not to travel very far outside their home range. Because this early attempt to develop American wines made from American grapes was done by what were considered foreigners, it would have very little influence on the development of American wine. When it came to wine, the Americans in the middle of the bell curve would continue to look to Europe as the model, and America, with one major and a few minor exceptions, would not develop their own commercially viable wine market until well into the 20th century. It would then, and continue on into the present, largely squander the riches of its local grapes. Okay, so those were the low-tech drinks. You brew it, you let the magic particles from the air or the barm ferment it, you let it sit a bit, and it's done. But in our young, in a hurry, no refrigeration, terrible roads country, wine and ale, cider and beer were slow. They were weak. They were fragile. They were heavy. If only there was some way to make alcohol that was more American-y, bigger, stronger, more efficient, and maybe more businessy. And that is where we get, finally, to very drunk America. Always drunk in some cases and almost never on the good stuff. Good stuff takes time, and I don't know if you've been paying attention, but if there's one thing early America has been emphatic about, it's that while they have land and trees and fish and space for ages, your average American is in a hurry. The one thing they do not have is time. No time for patience, craftsmanship, or finesse, and they certainly do not have time for aging. By the early 19th century, America started to acquire ever more stills, the pot and alembic types, the kind with the big bulb or container at the bottom and a snaky tube at the top. These do batch distilling. You put the lower alcohol fermented stuff in the bottom, and then you heat it up to get mostly the alcohol out. Through the 18th century, as scientific experimentation as a communal activity started to become more acceptable, improvements to stills and other experimental machinery spread throughout the science communities and the industrial distilling ones as well. But most of the improvements were local to Europe. The engineering support needed to make experimental improvements largely lay back there. So at this stage in America, even repairing broken stills was difficult. But with the continued expansion of the rum trade, as the sugar industry expanded and produced ever more molasses waste, rum became bigger and bigger business. I'm even willing to argue that rum made of molasses was, through the middle of the 19th century, the most American of distilled liquors. Now, there are a wide variety of arracs and rums made of different products of the sugar trade. There are the rum agricoles made from uncooked, freshly squeezed sugarcane juice. Ironically, these grew out of the ocean traffic problems caused by Napoleon's war on the rest of Europe and the rise of the sugar beet. Suddenly, French colonies couldn't get enough enslaved Africans to work all of the sugaring steps, and even if they could, blockades made it hard to ship the sugar back to the French metropole, and even if it did get back there, sugar beet sugar made locally was beating it out on price. So the French Caribbean came up with these more stable distilled products as alternatives to sugar. There are also the sugar and sugar cane derived arracs in South Asia and Southeast Asia and Indonesia, which are distinct from the grape or date-based anise-flavored arrac liquors found in the Levant. And in South America, there is a grand constellation of sugar cane liquors. But the particular molasses-based rums made from the sulfury, carbony molasses beers at their base. To specifically turn a waste product fouling the sugar islands of the Caribbean Sea into a profit center is a particular turn of American industry we will see happen over and over. The general habit of turning waste products into something useful, that's been happening as long as people have been making things. In the tight economies created in hand labor societies, this is simply the way survival is ensured. But America, as it comes into being during the rise of the mechanical and steam age, this society becomes especially ingenious at producing waste streams, and then figuring out a way to turn it into wildly profitable products. And that is why, despite its modern association with the Spanish-speaking rim of the Atlantic and tropical vacation, at its heart, rum is a fiercely American drink. And so, with this profit powerhouse, the markets for and manufacture of stills spread in America. More stills were more available. More blacksmiths and even more refined metal workmen were being educated. More coal was mined, and more metal of finer quality was manufactured. As a result, stills started to show up in the inventory of men with large estates and medium estates, and even in city homes. But not all of those stills were being used for rum. A fair number were being used to distill the ciders and fruit wines down into brandy. In fact, in the early 19th century, charging surrounding farmers for the use of the still to turn weak or indifferent cider into the strong stuff was an income stream for many of the people who lived in the big house. In English villages, fictional and historic, the house where the family that owned all the land lived wasn't just party central. It was often the center of much economic activity. It would often be where the local farmers would bring required and extra produce for credit and payment. And because the early economic system of the U.S. was modeled tightly after the English mode, especially when the large landowners started setting up their own house-centered villages, quite often many of the same economic ties were developed. In some cases, this would even be down to the same sort of rent-requiring relationship the English nobility had back at home, but more often the farmers would be freeholders. They owned their own land. But the large landowner would still function as an economic conduit. The large landowner would have a dock for boats to load and unload goods. He would host merchants who would make deals to purchase the produce of local farmers, and he might hold lines of credit so smaller farmers might purchase tools or needed materials while waiting to sell their produce. And quite often the main house would possess a still, and in the same way they would charge local farmers a portion of their grain to grind it in their mill, they would charge a fee of a portion of the brandy they produced to distill it. An additional way to make extra money at the central house was either to resell this brandy or, as Maine landowners often had large orchards, they would also sell their personal excess brandy. And even though the principles of distillation were fairly straightforward, in these days of almost no measuring instruments, the high cost of purchasing a still and the skill needed to produce a quality product, not to mention the labor to cut and haul the firewood and tend the fires, paying just a fee to get one's indifferent pear or apple cider or plum wine or peach wine or foxy grape wine turned into brandy that would keep longer and have many more uses might just be worth it. And so with these brandies being a product of swift economic exchange along with a general lack of tradition of aged and embellished brandies in England meant that though young America had almost embarrassing bounties of fruit, there was no development of specialty liquors. Neither the expertise nor the interest was there. So no particular or notable herbal liquors were concocted. But medicinal brews using wines, brandies, and rums were plentiful. Even as foraging the local flora for helpful herbs was looked down upon overall, when it was for medical care, exceptions were made. Crack open the back of any printed cookbook popular in the early 19th century, and the entire back is full of potions to be drunk to ward off or cure a gallimaufry of ills. There's palsy water, plague water, aqua mirabilis, surfeit water, cordial waters for winter, for spring, and for summer, as each season contained their own ills to be wary of. There are golden cordials, fever waters, cures for the stone, the spleen, the vapors, ways to deal with hysterical fits, the stitch, the grip, the dropsy, or vertigo. There are rather intense directions for cleaning, crushing, and then soaking a whole cleaned rooster or cock in herb wine or brandy or ale as a treatment for consumption. There are milk waters to deal with the cancerous breast, waters to strengthen the sight. There's black cherry water for ailing children, and a potion to subdue distempers in an angry husband. There are rue waters for fits of the mother, opening drinks for women suffering a variety of those mysterious feminine complaints, drinks to preserve the lungs, to settle the stomach, and of course, something to treat any man or beast having been bitten by a mad dog. There are things for toothache, for jaundice, for a rupture, that is a hernia, and rheumatism. And then there are recipes for a rather wonderful, if not nigh miraculous concoction called ushkoba. These often contain raisins, expensive spices like cloves, mace, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, dates, saffron, and possibly some of the lost peppers like cubebs and grains of paradise. But if you recall from episode 77, ushkoba is also the root of the word that got laundered into whiskey. There I also talk about how whiskey was used to expand trade with and influence Native American societies as England considered its options in trade and land expansion. But how did whiskey arrive and spread in America so that it would eventually displace rum as the most American alcohol? Well, as I said, stills were proliferating, as was the knowledge to make them. The English knew their ales, and the transformation of cider to brandy was old hat. But the particular expertise of turning bad grain-based beer into the strong stuff, that was much more in the line of the Irish, the Scots, and that peculiar historical wild card, the Scots-Irish or the Ulster Scots. Those last two being the same people, but the name depends on where you are in space and time. Yes, somehow the events that will lead to the Whiskey Rebellion, that actually didn't happen, and then the birth of American bourbon whiskey ends up tracing back to the high-handed decisions made by Henry VIII and his lifelong grudge against the Catholic Church of Rome, and using unrest along the English-Scottish borders in the 17th century to drop a bunch of cranky Scots in Ireland to largely be jerks to Irish Catholic landowners resulted in a bunch of people generally unhappy with their new digs. So they hauled their cranky self-sufficient selves across the Atlantic to the new America. And there, these Ulster Scots/Scots-Irish, they found the rudiments of this new American civilization. And they largely walked right through it and sought out isolated homesteads along rivers, surrounded by hardwood trees and familiar-looking hill shapes. Just as back home, the centers of economic activity were far away and banks were something on the side of streams rather than a place one stored money. So the practice of turning excess grain into whiskey proliferated in young America, especially in those places far away from the hustle and bustle of wharves along major rivers and the Atlantic Ocean. Most of these whiskey makers ended up using rye grains and corn, the two grains that were most likely to produce a surplus in early America. And they tended to live and operate upslope of the large landowners in the southern states. So the lowlanders were making brandy from fruit and the uplanders were brewing whiskey from grain. And it became evident in just a few decades to both of these groups that beer was a giant, unrewarding pain, not worth the trouble. The warm weather of these southern states would sour beer so fast it was hardly worth making. The one exception was to distill it into the much more stable whiskey. So by the early 19th century, American drinking habits began to split along climate and location lines. Up north, where cellars stayed cool and the ice harvesting industry was growing, beer and cider could remain popular. But in southern states where ice was a luxury, distilled spirits and fortified wines became the most common drinks. The Bostonian and his porter versus the Carolinian with his mint-flavored whiskey julep became the norm as preferences developed during this era. So alcoholic beverages, just like the other agricultural products, were dividing along climatic lines. Just as with jerky versus pemmican or pumpkins versus sweet potatoes, there was also a preference for beer and cider versus distilled liquors. And it depended on how fast the low alcohol brews would go bad. These were all lacking preservatives. In the main, aging was not a thing people did on purpose, and even when it happened accidentally, the only alcoholic products that were going to age were the whiskeys and the brandies, and occasionally the rums. But at this stage of the game, because distilled alcohols were more or less interchangeable for currency, there being that severe cash shortage, aging them beyond what happened incidentally to work with the market or shipping traffic was not anything that was being widely considered. And so, except for a few lucky accidents, the idea of fine distilled spirits, well-aged spirits, and secret recipes for herbally concocted spirits for anything outside of medical care were not considered in early America. Though people were noticing that rum from afar was sometimes mellower and finer than the locally produced stuff, There were plenty of people noticing that the whiskey from up in the hills that had been stranded in the back of someone's barn for a few years had more to recommend it than the fresh stuff out of the still. And everyone absolutely knew that you had to clean out those barrels before you used them to store your whiskey. Otherwise, the cheese, the fish, or the heaven knows what would give it a strange taste. A contemporary popular method for cleaning barrels, that is, fumigating them with burning brimstone, which is just solid sulfur, the brimstone vapor does a good job of killing the creepy crawlies with its emitted sulfur dioxide and sulfur trioxide. You'll know it. It smells recognizable. But the problem is that smell can be picked up efficiently by the stored alcohol. So over time, burning brimstone to clean whiskey barrels became less popular. Oh yeah, and it also required purchasing sulfur. On the other hand, simply charring the barrels to remove any evil odors was efficient and didn't require any materials between iron and fire already on hand. So, the same way it was noticed that rums that were a bit older were better, surely similar observations were made about different amounts of charring in barrels that had been cleaned for storing whiskey. After all, when you made a fresh barrel for the purpose of storing and transporting the whiskey out of the hills and hollers, it was surely noticed that different woods gave different results, and that fresh barrels produced a drink not as fine as those from used barrels that had been charred clean. In our modern era, there are several stories about this commercial producer or that who discovered the charred barrel method. But seeing the realities of how barrels were made, reused, and cleaned, it seems almost impossible that the method of charring barrels to store and age whiskey to mellow wasn't a project pursued by a number of people in a number of places, a number of times. So Americans may lack their Benedictines, their Fernets, their wide variety of Vossers, of aquavits, of Amaros, distinctive herbed liquors developed and guarded and shared, but they did stumble upon ways to improve their homegrown distilled spirits by playing with time and the reuse of materials. The tight relationship of alcoholic drinks to economic activity is going to give America a fairly unique relationship to their booze. From the beginning, alcohol was more economic asset than it was a method of communal bonding. This binding of liquor and money will cause interesting stressors in the market for and consumption of alcoholic beverages. Then there's the complicating factor of the Grahamites and the other vegetarians and self-denialists touting a return to man's glorious past as alcohol is developing into a major economic force. It means the seeds of prohibition are planted. The first green shoots will start to be seen in many places in the second half of the century. Here at the beginning of the 19th century, alcohol already has a regional character, and it's also used as a marker for class. It's a growing economic influence, and it's getting a notorious name. The English patterns that arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries were about to be disrupted by glass, by the rise of coffee and tea, by the arrival of more Germans, by faster transport speeds, and the growth of refrigeration. American drinking and not drinking developed their own character. And oh yeah, we'll do our best to wipe out European wine. But that's all in the second half of the century. We are still here in the first half. And that is where we'll be as I look at how migration through the Appalachians, in combination with the emergence of the railroad and the development of the metal plow, are going to start the transformation of the middle of the country into a breadbasket. Sure, there's going to be a few complications, so join me next time to see some of the ways American iron and American grain are absolutely entangled. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.